Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
I'm David Kellogg, publisher of Foreign Affairs, and welcome to this session of Foreign Affairs Live. I would like to give very special thanks to our sponsor for the evening, the International Bank of Azerbaijan. We are grateful for the bank's support. Following the program, you are all invited to a special reception, thanks to the generosity of the bank. As readers of Foreign Affairs, you are members of a very special community. The community has grown now to over 160,000. We are really happy to see so many subscribers here. One bit of news to share with you: in a couple of weeks, we are launching a new Foreign Affairs website, foreignaffairs.com, which will include some special features, including original pieces commissioned especially for the website. Another piece that may be interesting is the full archive back to 1961, eventually back to 1922, will be open to all subscribers. And subscribers and registered users will now be able to post comments on Foreign Affairs articles and other features, and we look forward to a lively discussion that I hope you will all be part of. Some housekeeping announcements. Out of courtesy to our speakers, please refrain from leaving the meeting early. I don't think you will want to, but just if you do, don't. Please turn off all electronic devices. You can whistle and stamp your feet if you agree with a position, but turn off your electronic devices. If you are called on to ask a question during the Q&A period, please stand, identify yourself, give your name and affiliation, and keep your question concise. With that, it's my honor to introduce our moderator and our esteemed editor, Jim Hogue.
Thank you, David, very much, and welcome to everybody. As you can see, we have a full house, including a room upstairs for those who come a little late. I'm not surprised. The topic is a rather hot one at the moment, and our two speakers tonight are both very experienced and very knowledgeable about the range of subjects that add up to the problems of the Middle East. Both are featured in our current issue, this one, January, February. Martin Indyk, former ambassador twice to Israel and now director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings Institution, is to my immediate left. And with our own Richard Haas, he co-authored in this January issue an article entitled Beyond Iraq, a New U.S. Strategy for the Middle East. And to my far left is Walter Russell Mead, who is the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy here at the Council. Just a word, Walter had a long plane ride, and on it he picked up a touch of laryngitis. He's a real yeoman to be here tonight at all, frankly. I'll say this, it may be a little hard to hear him, but the voice is much sexier than what I remember before this. With that, let's get to it. We're going to talk about a number of the problems in the Middle East, as you wish. I'm going to have you all ask some questions here in a while. But I thought we'd start with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in part because both authors deal with that in their pieces. And secondly, we have some fresh news that we need to digest and have some help from our experts to what to think about it. Most dramatically, I guess, at the moment is the Israeli election. Bibi Netanyahu looks like he's going to head the next government. He's in the process of trying to put together a coalition to govern. And what does that mean? Bibi has been prime minister before. He's generally viewed as a very conservative, rather hard-edged politician in Israel, and certainly from our vantage point back here. So I might start, Martin, by asking what a Netanyahu government this time around, how is it going to be different than the last time? And does it make much difference, given the nature of the problem we're talking about, whether it's a Netanyahu government or a Livni government? Floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you for not only hosting us tonight, but for the wonderful Foreign Affairs magazine. I'm very proud to have had an opportunity to publish again in what is obviously the leading journal for discussion of foreign policy ideas. Netanyahu, the one thing that there will be in common between the previous Netanyahu government and the one that's likely to be formed is, of course, the Prime Minister, Bibi himself. But I think that he learnt a number of important lessons from what was a very rocky and difficult prime ministership that ended early when his government collapsed and he then lost his re-election bid to Ehud Barak. Two things happened there. He had formed a right-wing, narrow coalition government, and he told me recently that he considers that it was a mistake not to have formed a national unity government with Shimon Peres after he had defeated him. Peres would have gladly gone into government with him. And that's why he seems so determined. I don't know how many of you are following the negotiations that are going on at the moment, but he seems very determined to try to bring Tzipi Livni's Kadima party into government so that he will have a broader, centrist, secular base for his government and not repeat the mistake that he considers he made in forming a narrow right-wing government. The problem with the narrow right-wing government that he had there was, as he explained, I was US ambassador at the time. As he explained it to me, he said, you know, Israeli politics are tribal, and my tribe is bigger than their tribe. He was talking about the opposition, the Labour opposition. But I have to feed my tribe. And feeding his tribe translated into settlement activity, because that's what the right-wing coalition that he ruled over wanted. That was red meat for them. And that, of course, got him into trouble with Bill Clinton, who didn't want him to expand settlements on the West Bank. He wanted him to give up territory in the West Bank. In fact, he just wanted him to fulfill the commitments made by the previous government of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres to give up territory in the West Bank. Finally, Clinton managed to convince him. He did not succeed in convincing him to freeze settlements, but he did convince him to give up a whole 13.1% of the West Bank. And as soon as Bibi agreed to that at the Y Plantation, his government collapsed. And he did not win re-election because the Israeli people, the major reason, I think, was because the Israeli people felt he had mishandled his relationship with Bill Clinton. That is to say, Israelis won't reward leaders for having a good relationship with the United States, but they'll punish leaders who mismanage the relationship with the United States because it is so important to Israel. So, what does all this mean? Is that Bibi does not want a narrow right-wing government. He will try to form a national unity government. But in the end, he may end up with a right-wing government because Tzipi Livni may decide that she wants to, that her future is better in the opposition, leaving him in a difficult situation and essentially unable to rule effectively. And so if he has a right-wing government, he'll be under pressure to do settlements. He knows that Obama is going to have a problem with that. He'll be under pressure to give up territory in the West Bank because Obama is committed to a two-state solution. And his own party, let alone the parties to the right of him, are not committed to that. So, therefore, I would say, bottom line in this very complicated situation is that if he ends up with a narrow right-wing government, he will seek to divert American pressure for a move on the West Bank by trying to do a deal with Syria. This is essentially what he did, again, in his first government. He went behind the backs of the Clinton administration to try to do a deal with the Syrian leader then. This time, I think he will try to do it in partnership with Obama and calculate that we, as well as he, will have an interest in a peace deal with Syria that would take Syria out of its alliance with Iran, realignment in the American-led peace camp, and that would be of strategic advantage to the United States as well as Israel.
Well, it would really take the pressure off of him to move forward on a two-state solution, wouldn't it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, in a sense, yes, because the focus would then be on a Syrian deal, but I don't think the Syrians are going to be willing to go ahead and make that deal unless things are moving forward on the Palestinian track. And I think that Obama will also, for other reasons, want to see things moving on the Palestinian track, partly because of the sense that the hope for a two-state solution is quickly evaporating, and that's highly problematic for Obama's now priority of trying to achieve an end to the Israeli conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict. But also because Obama wants to reach out to the Muslim world. And he understands very clearly that the Palestinian issue, not the Syrian issue, is the hot-button issue in terms of his relationship with the Muslim world.
I want to come back to some of that, but let me go to one particular point, because Walter's piece touches on it. One thing that Netanyahu has said publicly that he wants to do is not necessarily a political agreement that, at least on terms that the Palestinians would accept, but he wants to make a real effort to improve the economic situation on the West Bank. And Walter, that is the centerpiece of your piece, is that that's going to be essential if Israel is going to be able to come up with terms, some compromises from Palestinians as well as from themselves, that leads towards a peace at some point.
Yeah, although I have to say, and I rarely sound this much like Lauren Bacall.
You don't look like her, pal.
Sometimes after a hard night, possibly she. Anyway, when I wrote about working on some of the economic dimensions, that was actually in parallel with the political, not as a substitute. Because I think the point I was trying to make there is that many of us outside the Palestinian world overestimate the value to Palestinians of the two-state solution. That even at the height of Palestinian support for the two-state solution, it was a kind of a cool support and a grudging support among many people, like, this is the best we can do, as opposed to, gosh, I really want it. And I think if Netanyahu's hope is that he can distract Palestinians from politics with economics, I don't think that's going to be very successful. Not that people will say no to economic improvement necessarily, but as that this would resolve America's problems with the Arab world or Palestinian-Israeli tensions, I think is rather unlikely. In my sense, you need to be moving, you need to be using serious, not only economic concessions and arguments and incentives, but sort of justice and moral arguments and incentives together with the politics of a two-state solution. And I think that at this moment would probably be rather tough for Netanyahu, and especially if he's with a right-wing government.
You know, politicians, including Netanyahu, say some things when they're campaigning, and then they do something quite different when they're elected. We're about to see some of that in our own government. Netanyahu has said he'll never do anything with Hamas except crush them. He has, if I got it right, Martin, love to have a deal with Syria, but publicly he said he's not going to give back the Golan Heights, and on it goes. What is he really willing to do, and what is it that he wants now that he's, assuming he's going to be in office? Does he want just a contained situation with the Palestinians? Does he really want some landmark settlement. And let me tag on to that. In a scenario like this, in which so much is going to be so difficult to do, what's different about the George Mitchell envoyship from the role that many, including you, have played in the past?
Bibi is a pragmatic politician.
Mm-hmm.
He's not an ideologue. If he has an ideology, it's Reaganomics.
Right.
His formative years were here when he was the DCM in the embassy during the Reagan years. And Republican politicians in particular, loved Bibi because he was a better Reaganite and a better Thatcherite than they were. He's just they always used to say if he ran here, he'd be, he'd lead he'd get the Republican nomination. So he doesn't have a firm view about the disposition of the West Bank. He'll approach it from a security point of view, but he doesn't subscribe to the argument that this is the land God gave to Israel and we can't give it back. But Bibi is also described by his detractors as like a willow tree that bends in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
And he responds to the pressures that are on him of the moment. And the pressures that are usually on him are from his own party, which is a right-wing party, the Likud party. And don't forget the Likud party broke up. Kadima grew out of the Likud party with the people who were the centrists in the Likud party left for Kadima under Sharon. And it was Sharon who supported the idea of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. It's not clear that the Likud party will support that. And Bibi, as the leader of that party, is therefore constrained in that regard. So that's why he talks about an economic peace. And that's what he's going to try to do, I think, arguing that the Palestinians are so divided, they don't have the capabilities, they're not a responsible partner, so let's try to build up the West Bank economy and buy them off that way. Now, enter George Mitchell. George Mitchell is an unusual appointment as the special envoy for Middle East peace. CMEP is his acronym.
Right.
I don't know whether anybody had heard that before. I just saw it yesterday, CMEP. The CMEP is the first time since Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, began what became known as the Middle East peace process. This is the first time we've had a high-level envoy.
Right.
Every Secretary of State, except Hillary Clinton, has reserved this to themselves. And they've had more junior people or bureaucrats preparing the ground, whether it was Joe Sisko or Dennis Ross. They were essentially working for the Secretary of State who had responsibility for it. Even Secretaries of State who didn't want to do anything with it, like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, still preserved it for themselves, because this was the big enchilada, to mix my metaphors here. The holy grail of peacemaking.
Keep going. I'm sure another metaphor will come to mind.
That's right. Going for the brass ring.
There we are.
Right. So George Mitchell is a heavyweight in his own right. Former leader of the Senate, obviously has a notch to his belt in terms of the Northern Ireland Accords, and did a very credible job when he was appointed to head up the Commission of Inquiry into the origins of the Intifada back in 2001. And so he brings a lot of credibility to the effort. He's seen as fair. I think the Arab side, Palestinians, look at him as an Arab American. and see that this is a very different kind of appointment to the Jewish Americans like myself, who were working on the peace process. So he gets credit on the Arab side. I think the Israelis see him as a fair-minded person. They've had good relations with him. So he brings a lot of credibility and gravitas to the job. And I think it's a reflection, on the one hand, of Hillary Clinton's own sense of security, that she's prepared to have a heavyweight do the job. It's an indication of the seriousness with which Obama wants to invest this effort, that he's prepared to put Mitchell in that job. And both Clinton and Obama are there to add their heft to it. And they each have individually considerable heft, obviously as president, but Hillary Clinton, you know, is a rock star in her own right. Yep. So it really, I think, speaks of a seriousness. Now, what do you do with a kind of landscape that looks pretty barren? The Palestinians are divided. Now the Arab states are fighting amongst each other. There was a hope there that the Arab League Peace Initiative would provide a basis for the Arab states to get involved in a way that would compensate for the weakness of the Palestinians. It's not clear that that's going to happen. So I think inevitably, just as Bibi looks to the Syrian track, there's going to be an interest in seeing, on the part of George Mitchell, in seeing what can be done on the Syrian track as well. And one indicator of this, I don't think I'm breaking news on this, is that George Mitchell is heading to Ankara this week. Why Ankara? Because in last year, when the Bush administration was trying to isolate the Syrians and wasn't interested in trying to promote peace between Israel and Syria, the Turks came in and worked with the Israeli government and the Syrian government to put together the basis for a peace negotiation, and they did a very credible job. And so I think that Mitchell going off to Ankara is basically to look at a way of partnering with the Turks in an effort to get the Israeli-Syrian negotiations going.
You know, as you just mentioned, there are a lot of players in this game right now. Some of them sort of new. And I want to add a couple of others. Walter, maybe you can pitch in on this. We had the Egyptians taking a more concerted interest than they have in the past, and one of the roles they've been playing is to try to contain Hamas, which is an intra-Palestinian issue. And as you mentioned, we've got Turkey was playing a mediator role until Gaza sort of turned them off. And we've got King Abdullah, who is pushing his Arab peace plan rather heavily. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet, which is Iran. What do they really want out of this? Would they cooperate if we were to get all of these, this more regional approach moving? Walter?
I think you're right that Iran is the elephant in the room. And its presence and its attitudes are going to be affecting the American policy on this and U.S.-Israeli relations. Just for one thing, remember now you're going to have the U.S. is going to be going to Prime Minister Netanyahu and saying, and we want you to give the Palestinians a better deal on the West Bank than you want to give them, and make some concessions. So the U.S. will be pushing him there. But at the same time, the U.S. is going to be trying to negotiate with Iran and avoid a military confrontation with Iran over the nuclear program. As far as I can tell, the Obama administration is pretty committed to not having a military confrontation with Iran over its nuclear program, if at all possible. So Netanyahu's going to be saying, wait a minute, you know, you want me to sit still while Iran is moving toward a bomb, and you also want me to concede on the Palestinians. You're going to have to pick, I think. And Israel does have the possibility of creating a massive crisis in the Middle East by attacking Iran on its own, something the U.S. might not be able to escape responsibility for. I don't think Netanyahu's going to want to play that card rashly or foolishly, but I think it's a real card. At the same time, it's quite complicated. There are a number of Arab states who wouldn't be that unhappy to see a nice attack on Iran. They would consider that actually an excellent outcome.
Any of them in the room?
And that's actually amazing as an American when you visit the Middle East, how many people will invite you to lunch and tell you, bomb them now, don't wait. I'm not talking well. So how all of these things play out. And then again, imagine politically for the Obama administration here in the U.S., where it is both pressuring the Israelis in the Palestinian negotiations and taking a view which many on the right and even in the center might say is too soft on Iran. How will all of this play out for the Obama administration politically? I'm not sure they know. So we've got a very complicated game going on here, and obviously at any moment things could happen, like the president of Egypt could become ill, or all kinds of events could transpire that could make things erupt again in some way. So it's a situation in some ways, it's rather dangerous. We're all focusing on it with great intention and intent. We all have some ideas about what we'd like to see happen. But there are more variables than any of the players, I think, can fully account for or control. And that kind of background of uncertainty and risk and of great political stakes finely balanced is definitely going to be a part of what shapes the way the new Obama administration and the new Netanyahu government start to chart their courses in the region.
Okay, before we get Martin's input on this particular question, I just want to say I'm going to turn to the audience after Martin. If you have a question, put your hand up. I'll try and call on you as many as I can. State who you are. We have people with microphones along the side. They'll bring it to you, and away we go.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah, but I just want to add a little something to that and then have you comment on it, which is David Sanger in his new book, The Inheritance, has some revelations that the Israeli government, the Olmert government, went to Bush and requested the right to go ahead and bomb the nuclear installations as they are building in Iran. And he got as you put it, big red line, no, you can't do that. Would Netanyahu follow the same course, which is if we say no, would he stay no? Would his right-wing party, if that's what he ends up, right-wing coalition, put up with that? How serious should we take some of the chatter that's around now that the chances of an Israeli strike are greater with a Netanyahu win than it was before?
I actually don't think they're greater. I think that this is a bipartisan or non-partisan issue in Israel. In a strange way, it's a non-partisan issue in Iran as well. Hardliners and moderates feel that Iran should acquire nuclear weapons capability, and all Israelis think that it should not. So, and I think that Netanyahu will act very responsibly in this case, just because there's so much at stake. There's a sense in Israel, the military intelligence, which is responsible for the national assessment, declared just recently in Israel that this represented an existential threat. So it's official now that it's an existential threat. So when you're playing with existential threats, you're not playing politics. Now, Israel has a nuclear doctrine which essentially can be summarized as we won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, but we won't be the second either. And Not being the second means that nobody else gets to have nuclear weapons. So they bomb Iraq, they bomb the Syrian nuclear facility, and there's Iranian nuclear capability out there, moving in a very deliberate way, as the IAEA has now confirmed, towards a breakout capability. They have enough low-enriched uranium now that they could put it back through the centrifuges and get enough high-enriched uranium today for at least one nuclear bomb. We didn't expect they were going to get there. The Israelis didn't expect they were going to get to that point until the end of this year. So there's a real sense of urgency, one would think. And yet, in my experience, the Israelis seem to be less exercised about this today than they were 6 months ago. And I don't have a good explanation for that. One explanation is the one that Sam Lewis, some of you may remember Sam Lewis, he was long-time US ambassador to Israel. I think he served there for 7 years. And when I went out as ambassador to Israel, I went to see him, and he said, look, the thing you need to understand about the Israelis is, when it comes to nuclear issues, is they'll make a lot of noise, they'll ring the alarm bells, but if nobody else does anything about it, then what they do is they go quiet. And when they go quiet, that's when you need to worry. And he said, that's precisely what happened when I was there, and they bombed the Iraq nuclear reactor. It's hard for me to imagine, as Walter says, that with Obama trying to engage the Iranians and head off their nuclear program through diplomacy, that the Israelis are going to decide we're going to go ahead and bomb anyway. And they really can't. Iran is a distant power. Logistically, it's complicated to do it without American acquiescence. So I somehow think that the Lewis principle doesn't apply here, that they've actually reached the point where they're prepared for tactical reasons to let Obama try, right, with the expectation that he will fail and that when he fails, it will become clear that the military option is in effect the only option to deal with this.
All right, we're going to take questions. We'll appreciate it if you can keep them concise, because we have a lot of people who want to talk. Let's start right here. Coming your way.
Hi, my name is Gregory Mark Hill. And I'm a new subscriber, so thanks. During the Nixon-Kissinger open door policy talks with China, Henry Kissinger said something along the lines that we, the United States, must deal with China because China exists. What, in today's evolving world order, new world order, and the potential for China to be part of the G8 industrial states, what role or impact could China play in on the wish list for progress in the Middle East?
Well, I think there's some hope, so far not fulfilled, that China would be more supportive of the Western position on the Security Council about very tough sanctions. But in general, China has not wanted to engage at that level. China has been extremely helpful to the United States in dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue. But it is not the same kind of factor vis-a-vis Iran, and is unlikely to be, I think.
Martin, anything to add?
Well, I think Walter's absolutely right that, in fact, the effort to impose tougher sanctions on Iran has gained traction with the Europeans, but the Chinese and Russians have been unwilling to go along with toughened position. And in fact, the American negotiators who were involved in trying to toughen up the sanctions would complain privately, they weren't prepared to do it publicly, that the Chinese were quick to exploit any cutting back of European involvement with Iran to try to take advantage of it. So that they felt that they were actually undermining the effort at toughening the sanctions. The question in my mind is whether this will change. Hillary Clinton's obviously just been there, whether it is possible as the Iranians get closer and closer to the nuclear threshold, whether the Chinese will get more serious about it, just as they did in the case of North Korea. You know, the Chinese have an interest in Iranian oil and doing business with Iran, but I think it is at least possible with a new administration to talk to the Chinese about how, number one, this is really important for American national interests, and therefore they need to understand that in terms of their relationship with the United States, but also that it's not in the interest of China to have a nuclear arms race in the Middle East that could destabilize a region that they are growing dependent on for their energy supplies.
You believe that if they're allowed to get to the point of nuclear weapons capability, that it would kick off an arms race in nuclear weapons in the Middle East? And the first ones up would be whom? Saudi Arabia?
Well, the Saudis have, I think it's a matter of public record, contributed significantly to the Pakistani nuclear program in terms of financing it. Mm-hmm. And so there is an assumption that they could perhaps get one off the shelf, and that maybe they've even arranged that already. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but it would be logical. That's the way that the Saudis are not going to build a nuclear energy capability and then cross over. The Egyptians have decided some time ago not to go down that road, but the Egyptian, you know, Walter was giving you the sense that the Egyptians and the Saudis and the other Gulf Arabs are deeply threatened by this Iranian bid for dominance in the region, which is backed up by this bid for nuclear weapons capability. And so they, you know, for some reason, they managed to live with an Israeli nuclear capability kind of in the basement. But I don't think they're willing to live with an Iranian nuclear capability. And so I would expect that there will be a nuclear arms race triggered.
Yes, sir. Right on the aisle.
My name is James Collins. I'm a subscriber, long-time subscriber. It's much cheaper than on the newsstand. Given the fact that Iran has made a number of inroads with Venezuela and with Ecuador in recent years, and most recently in the last several months, given that Venezuela is building a naval base off their coast that presumably could carry a nuclear submarine, is there not some concern that even if we were to deal with Iran currently, if they were to develop a nuclear weapon, that this will just be an ongoing effort and that Iran's influence now in South America will limit American influence with respect to the Middle East, particularly given Iran's Iran's missile capabilities?
Okay. Walter?
Well, first of all, let me express my deep grief and sorrow about the plunge in the price of oil and the ways in which both Iran and Venezuela have so tragically been forced to adjust some of their spending to these new realities. It's, I think, and sort of the Russian fleet visiting Venezuela meant one thing when oil was $150 a barrel, and at $40 a barrel it means something very different. I think, in fact, this is sort of showboating. That if any country, I think the Monroe Doctrine is still there. And I think if any country were to try to do, say, again, what the Soviets tried to do in Cuba at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think it would be a very, very strong U.S. response. And I don't think Chavez wants to play with that kind of fire. He wants to sort of, pluck a few feathers out of the eagle's tail, but he doesn't want a full-fledged confrontation with the United States. So I think this is more nuisance than strategic threat, but it needs to be watched.
Yes, sir, right here.
My name is Amin Al-Kholi from Shah Capital in Dubai. Hasn't time already run out for a two-state solution, particularly given the facts on the ground with settlement activity over the last 2 decades? Are we not wasting time talking about this?
I'm happy to answer, but I also want to hear Walter on this.
Yeah,
Do you want to go first? Or?
Whatever. Why not? Then I can rest a little longer while you talk. One doesn't know. Certainly one doesn't know until one tries. It seems to me that up until this moment, we have never really given the two-state solution a true trial. We haven't, again, the geography is not going to change that much. We can all see that whatever the final boundaries would be between a Palestinian state and the state of Israel, they're not all that far from what the negotiators on both sides have been talking about. But the question is, what else is there that can be part of such a solution that could make it more of a true solution for the Palestinian people? As I argue in the article in Foreign Affairs, if it is not a solution that works for the Palestinians, it cannot be one that works for the Israelis. Because unless there is a deep and settled consensus in Palestinian society that the two-state solution is, if not an ideal resolution, is a legitimate and respectable one that serious Palestinians are committed to upholding, then I don't think long-term any Palestinian government can preserve its domestic legitimacy while providing the necessary security against what will in any case be a minority of rejectionists who want to continue the struggle a la IRA and so on. So what would that be? It's clearly more than just a little bit of money for people who can't go home. It clearly has to speak to the needs of Palestinians in the diaspora, in Lebanon and elsewhere. I think I'm not willing to say the two-state solution is dead until we've at least tried to figure out what the best possible two-state solution would look like. And it does seem to me, as I wrote in the Foreign Affairs piece, that neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis alone can put those pieces together. Again, as I argue in Foreign Affairs, the catastrophe that overtook the Palestinian people in the Israeli war for independence was not simply the result of Jewish attacks on Palestinians. It was two peoples found themselves in a struggle at the moment in which the sort of legal and security umbrella over them was taken off. The British gave up their mandate, and even in a sense more disgracefully than in India, Pakistan, sort of left these two peoples to struggle as best they could. The international community did not observe its obligation to protect either the Jews or the Palestinians at that moment. So the rest of us cannot consider ourselves to be innocent bystanders, urging these two hot-headed groups to settle their differences. We need to look at what can we do in terms of seeing that there is a legal resolution, a path to a decent future for Palestinians, yes, economic compensation. And let's try that. And if that fails, then we can talk about the end of a two-state solution. But I would hate to see, in a sense, because among Palestinians, you have the sense that the Israelis keep building settlements. Time goes by, we get no closer. It's just a rhetorical statement while nothing happens. And on the Israeli side, the sense that the Palestinians aren't really willing to give us what we crave. security and peace. So why should we make all these wrenching concessions and move all these people out of the settlements if we're not really going to get security, if the next day another rocket is going to come over from Gaza? So we've got to try, I think, to get both parties out of that static, locked-in confrontation. I hope the Obama administration would take the opportunity to do this. And certainly the reaction I've gotten to my article from emails, possibly from some of the people in this room, I don't know, would suggest that there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of interest in seeing something like this tried.
I think that's true, that the international community would like to see this resolved, identify their interest in resolving it, are willing to participate and support it. People on both sides, I think it's fair if you credit the public opinion polls, would support a two-state solution. So the problem is, Shimon Peres, you probably heard this, said, it's not, the problem is not the light at the end of the tunnel. The problem is we don't have a tunnel. And how do you build that tunnel? I think Walter started to talk about some of the elements of that. But I think the most important element is to reinstill faith that a two-state solution can actually resolve this conflict. At the moment, people don't believe it on either side, and I think you're reflecting that in your question. Yeah. Israelis don't believe there's going to be a responsible, capable partner there, that when they pull out of the West Bank, that the rockets aren't going to come into Israel just like they did from Gaza. The Palestinians see expanded settlement, and they say, well, what territory are we talking about here? And of course, Hamas says, well, negotiations never removed one settlement. Violence got rid of all the settlements in Gaza. So there's a problem with just the credibility of the negotiating process itself. But then, what's the alternative? The one-state solution? Well, Israel is not going to agree to basically create circumstances in which it will no longer exist as a Jewish state. And so the alternative is not some kind of secular democratic Palestine in which Jews and Arabs live together in peace and harmony. It's an Israeli state between high walls and essentially failed statelets in Gaza and the West Bank that will continue to mount violent attacks in one way or another, and will destabilize Jordan and Egypt over time, and undermine those peace treaties with Israel as well. You can already see the trend here. So therefore, it's really critical. It's urgent for the Obama administration, and I think President Obama has a unique ability to do this, to reinstill hope and belief that the two-state solution can actually solve this problem for both sides. And there are two essential things which George Mitchell recommended when he was head of this Commission of Inquiry into the origins of the Intifada that remain critically important in terms of this concept of reinstilling the belief that it can work. One is, Walter mentioned, is a settlements freeze, including natural growth. That was what he recommended then. By the way, the Sharon government accepted it back then. But the Bush administration was not prepared to pursue it. And on the Palestinian side, an end to violence, terrorism, and a dismantling of the infrastructure of terror. And those two things are going to be critically important for there to be any hope that this effort can produce a meaningful solution, meaningful for both sides.
Just a quick follow-up on that question. You mentioned the word urgent. Is it urgent just because it's so fractious at the moment? Or, as some commentators and analysts say, time is running out on the two-state solution. We've heard this many times before, but this time around there are pressures, demographic pressures, radicalization pressures that are greater than we've seen before. Where are you, Martin and Walter, on the proposition that if we don't get a two-state solution sometime in the very near future, it's probably gone for good?
Well, it's like in some ways, it's like the kings and queens of England. You know, the king is dead, long live the king.
Right.
Two-state solution is dead, but there isn't an alternative to it, so it lives on. But why is it urgent? It's urgent because the faith in it as solving the problem is quickly evaporating.
Right, on both sides.
On both sides. Yeah. On both sides. And that's why it's really important to try to show that it can work. And for that, you've got to start to rebuild trust in the intentions of the other side.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Linda Morales, and just to build on that question, in terms of the leadership, we know that on the Israeli side, we have the government that will be put together, and although many of the settlers may not agree with whatever settlement, whatever agreement is put in place, there is an infrastructure that will insist and create that, as they did in Gaza. What happens on the Palestinian side? What happens with Hamas? Is Hamas part of these negotiations? How does the Obama administration address them they are still a terrorist organization at this moment in time? So what happens between Fatah, Hamas, and what about once the agreement is negotiated? Is there enough credibility for those organizations to actually enforce whatever is decided?
Well, I think one of the reasons that I agree with Martin that this is an urgent issue is that with the death of Arafat, you saw the end of a very important era of the Palestinian national movement, where there was a figure who loomed over it. Now, his prestige had somewhat become eroded in the last few years of his life. But nevertheless, you know, there was someone who seemed to embody the Palestinian national cause. Today, there is no individual, there is no institution that plays that role. And so the question of how does this Palestinian people, who've never lived under a single political entity or institutions, how do they debate, reach a consensus, and act? Who is seen as being able to bind them morally by signing a piece of paper? And what does that piece of paper need to say? Now, one can see a couple of possibilities. One would be to try to attract Hamas into the peace process. There are certainly people in the Hamas organization who see themselves as practical, pragmatic politicians looking for a way forward. There are other people, too, in Hamas. And there's a fairly widespread sense among Palestinians that Arafat mishandled the whole process of coming in from the cold, accepting the existence of Israel, beginning the process of negotiations, that he did it too cheaply and got sort of snookered. So that at the end, he gave up the biggest card in his hand, essentially recognition of Israel. And what he got in return was the right to participate in endless talks that never got him what he wanted or needed. So even the sort of pragmatic folks in Hamas don't want to do that again. They don't want to repeat the Arafat experience. The question one has to think about is there another way into negotiations that could allow at least a big chunk of Hamas or people or a climate of opinion associated with Hamas to move into a serious negotiation. And how would that need to be constructed? How can we learn, in a sense, from the failure of the first peace process? But this is an extremely complex problem. And again, underlying this, I think we have to look, for example, at Gaza, and we have to realize, frankly, that a two-state solution is not a human solution for the problems that face most of the Palestinians in Gaza. Unlike the West Bank, where many of the Palestinians living on the West Bank are living where they've always lived, their ancestors lived. Some are refugees, but many are, that's home. So they're talking about getting the Israelis out of my home so that life in my village can be the way I want it to be. That's one thing. In Gaza, essentially an empty strip of sand into which refugees flooded at the time of the conflict. It's not really home to anybody in that sense, nor does it really have the sort of economic makings of a place where people can live what we would consider a normal life, what they would consider a normal life. So the ideal of the return as the goal of the peace process burns very brightly among those dispossessed refugees and descendants now of refugees. Because, by the way, at this point, you'd have to be 61 years old or older to have actually physically been a refugee from the War of Independence. This is, and so how does one take this, substitute, in a sense, an ideal of coexistence, a meaningful coexistence, for the ideal of the return that has kind of animated and organized Gaza? It's a problem for a group like Hamas trying to politically represent this population, even if it wanted to enter the path of negotiations. Arafat had a kind of a unique personal stature that enabled him to take risks that are harder for others to do. So this is enabling a critical mass of Palestinians with strong nationalist credentials. Let's not use party labels or anything like that, to embrace a serious path of negotiation. That's one of the things we have to sort of think about. What does that look like? How is it done?
Okay, Martin.
Oh, well, just listening to Walter, I would say it's hopeless. I mean, I don't disagree with your analysis. I just think it's beyond the ability of negotiators to answer those kinds of structural problems. What is, I would say, the first thing that has developed out of this latest war in Gaza is a de facto recognition that Hamas is not going away. The Israelis de facto recognize that by stopping short of moving in and toppling Hamas's rule in Gaza. They clearly decided they weren't prepared to do that. We don't need to go into all of the reasons, but that is basically left the reality that Hamas is in control in Gaza. And the negotiations over the ceasefire is to give Hamas the ability to have the passages open and strengthen its control in Gaza through the flow of goods in and out of Gaza and the flow of people in and out of Egypt from Gaza. So that's a kind of abiding reality now. The Obama administration has responded to this new reality, not by any declaratory policy, but essentially by not standing in the way when the Arab states have started now to talk about a new reconciliation process between Fatah and Hamas. And that de facto reverses a policy of the Bush administration, which was to try to block any reconciliation, build up Fatah against Hamas, and hope that Hamas would in effect be overthrown in one way or another. So I think that that as a practical process, we will see an effort to try to get a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. And the Arab states will lead that effort. The United States will not block it. And I don't think that Israel will either, although with the new government in Israel, we can't be sure. And what that is likely to produce is a national unity government on the Palestinian side that enters into negotiations with Israel. And Hamas ministers will be part of that government, but Hamas will somehow reserve its own position as a party, whereas the government will be empowered to negotiate with Israel. And if that comes about, and we're not there yet, then there will be a practical way of getting into a negotiation. But resolving the more, I don't know what you call it, existential or issues of for the refugees is an immensely more complicated problem, because essentially there are no homes for them to go back to in Israel. And Israel sees that very idea, conceding the right to that, as an existential threat. So that's where I think the Arab states are going to have to come in and support a resolution of this which turns a two-state solution into a 23-state solution, and provides a kind of Arab legitimacy for a resolution of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, in which the refugees will have their right acknowledged, but the exercise of the right in effect vitiated.
We're just about out of time, and I think we can handle one more question and answer. Yes, sir, right here.
My name is Atal Hindi. I just have, the Palestinians view the disengagement from Gaza not as a peace deal, or that Sharon was a man of peace, but as a method of concentration for overall authority within the geographical region. And the same thing with the vision, with the wall that's being built in the West Bank. I happen to be from the West Bank, and my village never shot a bullet at any Israelis within the past 20 years, as far as I know. And we're not allowed to enter into the rest of our olive trees. But my question is this: with this method, we honestly see that the Palestinians have been viewing the Oslo Accords as a failure, and therefore the Palestinian Authority as a failure. And their new analysis is to create a provisional government and a redeclaration of their independence based on UN Resolutions 242 and 338, that when they do this, that they exert their authority over the entire West Bank and Gaza Strip. And with this, the integration of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other organizations, organizations controlled by Syria and controlled by the Egyptians as well, whom we all know many times don't really want to help out the Palestinians. But we understand that if they do this, then there's going to be this can evolve into a third intifada. And my question is, how can the Israelis and even the Americans deal with it?
Walter?
Deal with the third intifada? Yes. I imagine the Israelis would deal with the third intifada more or less as they dealt with the first two, tough it out. But I think more broadly, the question of, are there political alternatives and options for the Palestinians? Are there sort of creative ways of looking at what is an extremely frustrating and unsatisfactory status quo? It's very important. And I think the question of a declaration of independence for Palestine is, is a card that Palestinians have in their hand. It's probably one of those cards that one is better off getting people to pay you a price so you don't pay it. Play the card than playing the card. Because I think it's unlikely that it would actually, as a practical matter, you say, more likely lead to a third intifada than to some sort of better state. On the other hand, so, it's something obviously Palestinians need to think about.
Martin? you might add, since we're closing, is there any reason to be more hopeful or less hopeful now than with the last American administration? Because while we can't solve the problem, an American administration is vitally important to the process.
Yeah. I think that I mean, it's hard to see how it will play out if you had another major uprising. But I assume that it would focus on the settlements and settlers in the West Bank, because the wall, fence, barrier, and so on makes it very difficult to engage in violence against Israelis. Of course, the Israeli army is there, and there's always the opportunity for action there. But I think Walter's right. The Israelis will respond to the use of force with force, as we've seen before. The question in my mind is, will they respond in the way that Sharon did, in terms of evacuating settlements from Gaza? Will they evacuate settlements from the West Bank and basically leave the army in place? But the consensus for Israelis is to keep settlement blocks, which are effectively behind the barrier. And so, I can imagine that, but that just fulfills that other vision that I was talking about of, an Israeli state behind high walls and these kind of failed statelets in the West Bank and Gaza that are squeezed on all sides by the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Egyptians. And it doesn't hold out a prospect for independence. And that's the critical question the Palestinians will have to ask themselves before they go down that road. Will they really achieve their objectives in that way, or will it yet again be counterproductive and destructive? So I would, it's easy for me to say, but I would much prefer that everybody make a real effort now to try to negotiate a solution and to reinstill the negotiating process with credibility. And that's why I come back to what I think is critical in this as the first steps, which is settlement freeze, including natural growth, and serious efforts to stop the violence. It's kind of the opposite of the process that you're describing here, but that's the only way that the negotiations can have a chance of meeting the requirements of both sides. In terms of your question, Jim, I want to go back to something that Walter said about the immense complexity of this situation. And it's not just that there are so many cross currents, but we as Americans don't really understand all of these cross currents and don't exactly know how we can play them if we don't understand them. But what I do know from the experience of the 1990s, when we had a president who made resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict his priority, just as Barack Obama has done now, is that when we moved in with initiatives designed to try to resolve the conflict, what inevitably happened was we push on one door and another door would open. We expected to make a deal between Syria and Israel. We ended up with Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn. And so inevitably you have to expect the unexpected, but it's really important to make the effort, even if we can't know for sure. And come back to what Richard Huss and I wrote in our Foreign Affairs piece, is that we argued there essentially for three simultaneous initiatives. And believe it or not, I think that's what the Obama administration is going to do. One, to try to resurrect a credible negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians. Second is to resurrect an Israeli-Syrian negotiation. And the third is to try to engage the Iranians. And if we can start to make some progress on one or the other, it will, I believe, generate a positive dynamic. The Iranians are worried that the Syrians are going to make a deal with Israel. They may decide they better move forward. If the Syrians are worried that the Iranians are going to make a deal with the United States. They may decide they better make the deal. If the Syrians move forward, the Palestinians will feel that they have greater cover. It will put pressure on Hamas and Hezbollah and give the Arab states an ability to engage more with Israel because the Syrians are dealing with Israel. So, you know, we can't have any certainty about how this is going to work itself out. The one certainty I have is that it's better to try, even if you fail, than not to try at all.
Gentlemen, thank you for a very thoughtful discussion.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.